So, I've got something super cool for you today on faith fuel freedom, and I'm really excited to dive into it. You know those amazing stories that Jesus used to tell? The ones that, totally changed how people saw the world?
Oh my goodness, yes, the parables, right? And they're absolutely incredible because you know what I mean? They're these seemingly simple stories, but they pack such a powerful punch. I mean, I've been studying these for years and I'm still discovering new layers of meaning in them.
That's exactly why I wanted to talk about this today. Like, these stories have been around for, 2,000 years? And they're still, super relevant?
Absolutely, absolutely. And that's the beauty of it, right? These stories, they're timeless, they're universal, and they speak to everyone regardless of where they're from or what century they're living in. I'm actually really excited to break down some of these parables and show just how meaningful they are for us today.
Well, I can't wait to learn more about them from you, especially about how we can apply them to our lives right now. So, let's start with one of the most famous ones, the Good Samaritan. I've heard of it, but what's the real message behind this story?
Oh, this one is it's absolutely incredible. So, and the story goes like this. There's this man who's traveling from Jerusalem to Jericho, right? And he gets attacked by robbers. They beat him up, take everything he has, and just leave him there to die, basically.
Um, that's that's pretty intense. What happens next?
Well, and this is where it gets really interesting, right? So, two religious leaders, people who you'd expect to help, they actually see this injured man and they walk right past him. Can you believe that? And these weren't just any religious leaders. They were like the spiritual celebrities of their time.
Like they just ignored someone who needed help?
Exactly. But then, and this is the beautiful part, a Samaritan comes along, and you know what I mean? In those days, Samaritans were totally looked down upon by Jewish people. They were considered like outsiders, enemies even. But this Samaritan, he stops, takes care of the man's wounds, brings him to an inn, and even pays for his care.
So it's really about breaking down those, social barriers?
Yes, yes. And it's so much more than that. You see, Jesus is totally flipping the script here. He's showing that true neighborly love, it doesn't care about social status or background or any of those things we use to divide ourselves. And you know what's really powerful? The person showing mercy is the one society least expected to do so.
How do you think this applies to us today?
Oh my goodness, in so many ways. Like, think about it. We still have these divisions today, right? Maybe they're not between Samaritans and Jews, but we've got our own modern barriers, political differences, social status, cultural backgrounds, and the message is just as relevant. True compassion means crossing those lines, stepping out of our comfort zones, and helping someone even when society says they're not our kind of people.
That's really powerful when you put it that way.
And you know what really gets me? It's not just about helping, it's about going above and beyond. The Samaritan didn't just call emergency services, right? He invested his time, his money, his energy. And that's the challenge for us today. To not just do the minimum, but to really, truly care for others, regardless of who they are.
So, the Prodigal Son is another really famous one. What makes this story so, special?
Oh my goodness, this one it totally touches my heart every time. So, and it's about this father who has two sons, right? And the younger son, he does something absolutely unthinkable for that time. He goes to his father and basically says, "Give me my inheritance now," which is it's basically saying, "I wish you were dead."
That's pretty harsh.
Right. And the amazing thing is, the father actually gives it to him. So this son takes all this money and just leaves, goes to a distant country and just wastes everything on wild living. Like totally squanders his inheritance until he's got nothing left.
So, what happens when he runs out of money?
Well, and this is where it gets really interesting. So there's this terrible famine, right? And he ends up taking this job feeding pigs, which, for a Jewish person, that was literally the lowest of the low. And he's so hungry that he's actually wanting to eat the pig food. Can you imagine?
That must have been his rock bottom.
Exactly. And that's when he has this this moment of realization. He thinks, you know what? My father's servants have it better than this. So he decides to go home and just beg to be a servant. But here's the absolutely beautiful part. When the father sees him coming, like way off in the distance, he runs to him.
In those days, did fathers usually run?
No, not at all. It was considered totally undignified. But this father, he doesn't care about dignity. He's overcome with love and compassion. And instead of making his son work as a servant, he throws this huge celebration. Gives him a ring, the best robe, everything.
So it's about forgiveness, right?
Yes, but it's so much deeper than that. It's about this unconditional love that just keeps waiting and watching. And in today's world, where we see so many broken relationships between parents and children, this story just resonates so powerfully because it shows that no matter how far we've strayed or how badly we've messed up, there's always this possibility of coming home, of restoration.
That's beautiful. But what about the other son?
Oh, see, that's another fascinating layer. The older son, he gets angry about all this celebration. And he's been faithful all along, right? Never left, always worked hard, but he can't celebrate his brother's return. It really shows how sometimes our own self-righteousness can blind us to the beauty of grace and redemption.
So we've talked about the Good Samaritan and the Prodigal Son, but there's this other parable that's always kind of puzzled me. The one about the sower and the seeds.
Oh, yes. This one's actually, and I absolutely love this parable because it's so visual, you know? So, and basically there's this farmer who's going out to sow seeds, right? And as he's scattering them, they fall on different types of ground.
What happens to all these different seeds?
So, and this is where it gets really interesting. Some seeds fall on this path, right? And they get eaten up by birds straight away. Then some fall on rocky ground and they spring up super quick. But because there's no deep soil, they just wither away as soon as the sun gets hot.
And there are other types of ground too, right?
Exactly. Some seeds fall among thorns, and even though they start growing, the thorns they totally choke them out. But then, and this is the beautiful part, some seeds fall on good soil, and they produce this amazing harvest, like 30, 60, even 100 times what was sown.
So what's the deeper meaning behind all these different, soil types?
Oh, see, this is where it gets really powerful. The seed is it's the spiritual truth, right? And the different soils represent how people respond to it. Like the path, that's when someone hears the truth, but it doesn't even sink in, you know? It's gone before it can take root.
What about the rocky ground? That seems different.
Right. And the rocky ground, that's like people who get super excited about spiritual truth at first, and when things get tough, when challenges come, they just give up. There's no depth there, no real commitment. And the thorny ground, that's when people let life's worries and the attraction of other things just totally crowd out their spiritual growth.
And the good soil?
That's the heart that's really ready to receive truth. And not just receive it, but actually live it out, you know? It's someone who hears the message and really lets it transform them. And the amazing thing is, we can actually choose what kind of soil we want to be. We can prepare our hearts to be more receptive, more open to growth.
You know what I've been thinking about? How do these parables, actually fit into our lives today? Because sometimes ancient stories can feel, well, disconnected from modern life.
Oh my goodness, yes! And that's actually what I find so absolutely fascinating about these parables. They're timeless, you know? Take the Good Samaritan, right? In our modern world, it's so relevant because we're still dealing with these same issues of prejudice and who we consider our neighbor.
Can you give me some real-world examples of what that might look like today?
So, and this actually happened to me just last week. I was at this coffee shop, right? And there was this person who was clearly having trouble with their car in the parking lot. And you know how it is. Everyone was just walking past, totally absorbed in their phones, right? But it made me think of the Good Samaritan, and I had to help.
That's really interesting. What about the prodigal son? How does that translate to modern life?
Oh, this one's actually super relevant in today's world. Like, think about families dealing with addiction, or and when adult children make choices their parents don't agree with. The message of unconditional love and forgiveness is just, it's so powerful in these situations, you know?
What about the sower parable in our digital age?
And this one's probably the most relevant of all, because in our world of constant notifications and social media and endless distractions, we're literally living in thorny ground. Like, how many times have we picked up our phones to read something meaningful and suddenly we're watching cat videos, right?
So how do we actually apply these lessons in our daily lives?
So it's really about making these small but meaningful choices every day. Like when we see someone struggling, maybe it's a coworker who's having a rough time, and maybe it's a stranger who needs directions. We can choose to be that good Samaritan. And with the sower parable, it's about creating these intentional spaces in our lives where truth can really take root and grow.
These parables seem to be more about action than just understanding.
Exactly. And that's what makes them so powerful even today. They're not just stories to understand. They're like blueprints for living. You know, each one is calling us to actually do something different, to be different. And then the amazing thing is, when we start living them out, we see how deeply practical and relevant they really are to our everyday lives.
Um, you know what really stands out to me after this whole conversation? These parables, they're not just stories. They're actually life lessons that keep on giving.
Oh my goodness, yes. And they're so beautifully interconnected, right? Like whether we're talking about the Good Samaritan or the Prodigal Son and the Sower, they all point to these fundamental truths about love and compassion and personal growth.
What would you say is the biggest takeaway for our Faith Fuel Freedom listeners?
So, the really beautiful thing about these parables is that they're not just ancient wisdom, you know? They're like they're living, breathing guides for our everyday lives. And what Jesus did with these stories was absolutely genius because he took these complex spiritual truths and made them so accessible through these simple stories that just stick with you.
Um, any final thoughts for our listeners?
Yes, I would really encourage everyone to take these parables and just sit with them for a bit. Like maybe pick one that really speaks to you and just think about how it might change the way you interact with others tomorrow, you know? Because at the end of the day, these aren't just stories to be heard. They're truths to be lived.
Thank you all so much for joining us today on Faith Fuel Freedom. Until next time, keep seeking, keep growing, and keep letting these timeless teachings transform your life.